Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ganga Jamuni Foundation's live series. We've often been asked questions about explicit erotic imagery on our temples or in cave paintings. One has often wondered how people in ancient India viewed sexuality and how the arts shaped ancient societal structure. To answer these questions and the related ones, we have a guest who really needs no introduction. He's a career diplomat, a Sanskrit scholar, a translator of classical works. Shri Aditya Narayan Dhairyashil Haksar was born in princely state of Gwalior. He was educated at the Doon School and later at the universities of Allahabad and Oxford. Shri Haksar joined the Indian Foreign Service. During the course of his career as a diplomat, he served as the Indian High Commissioner to Kenya and the Seychelles. He was a minister in the United States and ambassador to Portugal and Yugoslavia. He was also the first dean of the Foreign Service Institute. Post his retirement, Sri Haksar has dedicated his time and scholarship to translating works of Sanskrit, thereby making classics both available and accessible to a larger audience. Among his translations include Dandin's Dashakumar Charita, Kalidas's Raghuvansham, Ritusamhar, Urubhangam, and other plays of Bhasha. He's also translated Kshemendra's Samay Matrika, Subhashitavali, and verse anthology of Bhrathari. During our conversations leading to this talk, Sri Haksar shared with us his latest project, the much anticipated translation of one of the finest examples of lyrical poetry in Sanskrit, the Amaru Shataka, which we shall discuss today given the time. So, without further ado, let me welcome on behalf of our viewers and Ganga Jamani, Sri Haksar, to our studio. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Shagufta, and thank you very much for having me on your program. I am delighted to be with you and all your audience guests. Thank you.
Sir, the pleasure's all ours, and we're so happy that you were able to find time and such a lovely opportunity for us at Ganga Jamuni. So I won't take much time, but I just would like to know a little bit about your experience as a translator and how did you start translating your journey into translation Sanskrit and how you render the Sanskrit verse into English. So could you shed some light on that?
Well, I don't want to spend your time telling you about my life history, but I can tell you this that when I started the process of reading and translating from Sanskrit, my purpose was twofold. One was to learn the language better through the process of translation. And the second objective, which developed as the translations went on, the second objective was through translation to bring before the public eye of today those Sanskrit works which had been overshadowed by time and which people didn't know about today and which are worth knowing. So this is why I started doing what I'm doing. And in the process of translation, since you asked me this question, let me tell you that broadly speaking, translation process can be divided, in my opinion. I am not an academic specialist, but I think translations can be seen as either literal or literary. In literal translations, the effort is to translate word for word as it is in the original with the intention of making students of the original understand the words of the original better. So it is purpose is to increase, open a gate to knowledge, how to understand it. In literary translations, the attempt is not only to present the original manuscript in as corresponding to the original, but also to convey not only the meaning of each word, but to convey the spirit and the flavor and the emotions of the whole. So, in literary translation, one makes certain variations. It's not literal, but it is something to make the reader understand the basic values of the material that he is reading. And I have, over time, devoted myself to literary translations. My attempt is, through translation, to bring before the reader, behind the audience and the reader today, the spirit of the work, the manner in which it is presented, and its flavor and its sentiments. And to what extent it has succeeded or not depends upon the person who is reading it. But from what I have, the responses that I have received so far over the years, I get the feeling that I have, to some extent, succeeded in people seeing this face of Sanskrit, which, in my opinion, deserves to be seen now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, it's said that poets are fickle, egotistical creatures whose immortality rests on their body of work. So, not content with just that, they claim to infuse life into their subjects. So, I'm going to quote from your translation of Subhashitavali, and this is verse 45. It says, King Ram was extolled by Valmiki, Dharma's son by Vyas, Sri Vikram, Lord of Men, was by Kalidas, the poet. Bhoj by Chittappa and Bilhan, and Karn by Vidyapati. These monarchs became famous because of great poets, not by the tumult of their battle drums. Now, this also brings to mind something similar, which is echoed by Urdu poet Momin. इजाज़त जान दे है हमारे कलाम को, जिंदा किया है हमने मसीहा के नाम को. Now, given that and the rules of poetics of classical Sanskrit, sir, so for instance, like, Mukta Chanda, that is not found in English. Could you share your experiences in translating and rendering Sanskrit verse into English, your own experience? What did you think about this?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for reciting one verse in the translation in English and the other verse in the original in Urdu. And the sentiment which they both convey is more or less the same. And basically, the sentiment is that through poetry, the deeds of a big person can be made better known. Now, your question about Muktaka and how I translate it. Now, the word Muktaka by itself means independent. Another word for Muktaka in the language of poetics is Subhashita, which means well said. And a considerable part of Sanskrit writing has, over the centuries, been devoted to Muktaka or Subhashita Chandas, independent shlokas. Now, why it has been like that, one can make a guess. And one guess is that in ancient times, the art of writing, distributing written material was limited. So much of the material which was written and composed was made known and remembered through memory. So the idea was that in the spirit of, in the writing would be such which would be easy to remember and easy to pass it on verbally by recitation. So this is why the Muktaka or Subhashita Chanda was written. And such verse formations are to be found everywhere in Sanskrit literature, from the epics to poetry to prose, even in scientific books. After explaining something, when the conclusion comes, the conclusion is put in a Muktaka Chanda so that the reader can understand it better and pass it on to others. So this is why it's like that. And since I have come across so many Muktakas in the course of my work, I found that to translate Muktaka was a very enjoyable experience and naturally also a very challenging experience. So one tries to convey in a Muktaka both the meaning of the little verse and the spirit of the little verse. The only problem is that in trying to do so in English, the most Muktaka chandas are of 4 lines. But to do it in English, sometimes it takes, you can do it sometimes in 4 lines, but on many occasions, it takes many more than 4 lines. So I have had this experience. If you look at my translation called the Subhashita Vali, Subhashita Vali means a garland of Subhashita verses, that is Muktaka verses. And it consists entirely of what you describe as Muktaka, single verses which convey the spirit and the meaning entirely of that verse. And in translating them, I found that some could be done briefly in 4 lines, and others required more lines to do it. Well, this is one of the challenges of all translation. And after the Subhashita Vali, I've done the same thing with others. The latest, which will be coming out, I hope, in a couple of months, will be the Amaru Shataka. And Amaru Shatakam is all love lyrics. They are all written in Muktaka, single stanza love lyrics. And a famous critic 1,000 years ago said that these single stanzas are so good that each stanza is equal to a whole poem. So one has to try to convey this spirit in very brief, but the whole of it as best as one can.
Wonderful. We will be talking about Amaru Shatak. Um, so before we go on to that, could you tell us something about, when we were discussing this earlier, there's a perception surrounding Sanskrit literature and the layperson. Now, the perception really is that, people believe that a substantial part of Sanskrit literature is of a religious nature. Now, I wonder if this perception is one of legacy, which is possibly to do with the English, which was, egged on by considerations including utilitarianism and, translated text of religion and law and left it at that. Now, if one is to survey Sanskrit literature, there's a huge and diverse body comprising works on governance, performing arts, music, aesthetics, grammar, poetics, biographies, comedies, love, and erotica. Now, in addition to this, there's an overlap actually, which I understand. For instance, there are tenets of governance in the Mahabharata. In Kama Sutra, discusses aesthetics and arts at length, as also the lives of the people in the cities. Banabhat's Harshacharita, essentially a biography, has erotic interludes, and Bhasha's plays, though based on the Mahabharata, have scant religious elements. So I now know better that to classify Sanskrit literature into a block of secular or religious would not really be the right thing to do. So could you shed some light and dispel the notion of this, like this religious versus the secular?
Well, let me start off by saying that the notion and the thought religion versus secular is a very, very modern concept. And it is a concept which is now used not only in academic and literary terms, but more and more, as you and I and everyone knows, religious and secular is used in political terms. Even when you said religious versus secular, it is putting it in the notion of some kind of political confrontations. Now, what I would like to tell you is that Sanskrit verse, like all of Sanskrit literature, is basically one combined whole. It's not divided into sections. The language it is used for describing various kinds of works. When you are the language is used for mathematics, for science, for agriculture, for lots of books about how to do things or how to understand things. There is no question of religious or secular about it. When you when the language deals with more general matters, then people today now see them as religious and secular. But actually, it is all a part of the same thing. Now, you mentioned governance and Mahabharata. In one of my books of translations called The Seduction of Shiva, which is a translation of tales drawn from a cross section of Sanskrit literature, there is one tale which I have translated from the Mahabharata. And that tale, it's a very interesting thing. No one knows about it anymore because people know the story of the Mahabharata, but these little snippets which occur in it tend to get forgotten. And this snippet is that towards the end of the war, when the great grandfather of both sides, Bhishma, is lying on his deathbed, he is approached by the victorious king, Yudhishthir, for a dialogue before he dies. So he asks him a lot of questions about life and many kinds of things. And one of the questions which King Yudhishthir asks Bhishma, "Sir, please tell us who enjoys sexual life more, a man or a woman?" So then Bhishma looks at him and says, "Let me tell you a story." And then the story is told of another legendary king. And this particular episode is really about that legendary story. And that legendary king, it so happened, by some miracle, started his life in the masculine gender and then got converted to the feminine gender, and in both genders married and had children. And then when towards the end of his life, when he was doing some good deeds and so on, he was asked by the gods, "Now because you have done good deeds, we'd like to give you some reward. In which gender would you like to continue to live?" So the king told them that I prefer to live in the female gender, because the female gender provides greater pleasure than the male gender. So this is the story that Bhishma Pitama told Yudhishthira. So you have examples like this, and so far as the overall collection of Sanskrit literature is concerned, these stories are examples of how such material is spread over all kinds of literature. Even Mahabharata is a subject which covers everything under life. It also has this kind of thing. So does the Ramayana. So do the earlier texts which are now known as religious texts. For your information, another work which I am recently translating and which is I hope will come out early next year is a play by Kalidas called the Vikram Urvashi. And Kalidas got the story of the play Vikram Urvashi. The original source is no less than the Rig Veda, where the story is told. And the story is about how two, a man and a woman, how they react to each other in the course of their union and their life together. So you have this kind of material scattered everywhere. And then you have, on the other hand, works to go to another extreme, something which is known as an erotic work, Kama Sutra. If you actually look at the Kama Sutra, which I have had the honor of translating, the Kama Sutra consists of 7 books. And out of 7 books, only 1 book is about sexual practices. And the other 6 are about social life, how one should get on in life, how one should live, how men should live, how women should live, how they should meet, all kinds of things like that. And it begins not with any prayers to any gods, but it begins by invoking the 3 ends of life: dharma, artha, and kama. And it says that all 3 have important functions in human life. So you have this kind of situation, and Sanskrit literature, it is difficult to just try to put it into separate corners to say that this is secular, this is religious, because it's all mixed up.
Right, sir. So, so what I understand is that something like calm or karma permeates Sanskrit literature, whether it's the texts of grammar of poetics, kathas or narratives, epics, verses, instruction manuals, and finally even the texts of Kama Shastra themselves. So Jaydev in Geet Govind says at the beginning that it is as much for the devotees of Krishna as for the person interested in the arts of love. Now you've translated, as you just mentioned, a variety of and vast majority of these, including the Kama Sutra, Ritu Samhar, Subhashitavali, Shukar Saptati. An erotic episode also features in the Mahabharata features in your collection the seduction of Shiva and Amaru Shataka, which you mentioned is set to go to print. So, could you, based on your works, elucidate on love and eroticism as one finds in Sanskrit literature, in the manner in which it's dealt with, how this eroticism or love or the arts of love is really depicted? It's a philosophical underpinning, if there is any.
Well, in order to answer this question, I would go back to an earlier question which you had posed about secular and religious, and the history of how that came to be, that kind of division or perception came to being. And as I told you, that everything is one whole, but perceptions keep changing over the time. And it so happened, for historical reasons, over several centuries, in present times, the perception of the Sanskrit literature tended to get more and more confined to sacred texts. You probably know that the very first English translation of a Sanskrit work, which happened even before the French Revolution, was done by a person from the East India Company, whom the company had deputed to go to Banaras and learn Sanskrit, and he learned Sanskrit. And he came back, and the very first work which he translated and published was the translation of the Bhagavad Gita. So that is how the Bhagavad Gita came into present perceptions now. And this was published, and the foreword to that Bhagavad Gita translation was written by the then Governor General of India, whose name all history students in India know, Warren Hastings. And in the introduction, Warren Hastings wrote that this translation is being put forward to enable people to know more about the culture and the history of Indian life. So this is how it was done. Then this process continued over many years. On the artistic side, the first work which was translated, maybe about 10 years after the Bhagavad Gita, was Kalidasa's play Shakuntala. And Shakuntala made a big hit in Europe, and it then led to many other translations of other kind of works. But then it so happened that during the course of the 19th century, as imperialism developed and more translations took place, they tended to concentrate more and more on religious and philosophical texts in order to enable the reader to understand better the history and the background of India. So we had a situation when such texts, a very famous name is Max Muller, of which we are all aware. There's a street, Max Muller Road, in Delhi itself. And he was a professor at Oxford, and he spent 25 years making a collection of translations and editing them and so on. It's a huge collection of Max Muller's works, and the whole lot is called Sacred Books of the East. And it is all Vedic and such literature. So one result of that was that other literature tended to go into a background. And now I think the time has come, and many people are now realizing it. So more and more people are now trying to unearth and translate, retranslate purely literary works, which may also have some philosophical or religious dimensions, but which are overall literary works. And that process has started now. It's been going on for some time. And I am trying on my side to make a very small contribution to it by trying to bring into the public eye those works which are either totally forgotten or which were little remembered. And the best example I can give to you of that is two works which I did in recent years. Both reflect a confluence of religious cultures. The Hindu and the Muslim. One work is based upon Arabic and Hebraic sources. It is called the Suleiman Charitra. And it describes the love life of David and Bathsheba in the language of the Kama Sutra. The other work is based upon a famous Persian Farsi poem, which at one level is a love story, and at another level is a story of the soul in search of God. So you see, you have this kind of activity, but these things were not known. People were not aware that such things were existing in Sanskrit literature. And there are many more such works. So my attempt has been to, let us say, try to uncover a greater portion of Sanskrit literature than is available just now.
That's so wonderful, and I'm sure that many people will benefit. And you said it right that the time has come. So, sir, we're going to talk about Amaru Shatak now. So, could you tell us, about Amaru Shatak, and then we're going to be talking about some aspects which were until very recently taboo topics. In fact, many people would like to talk about them in a hush hush tone. But before that, could you tell us about what is Amaru Shatak? Because that's your upcoming book, and let's hear about that. And what is the plot of Amaru Shatak like, and what does it emphasize on?
Well, I'm glad that you asked this because naturally this is something which is closer to me than any other work, because this is only recently done, and now it is in a stage when uh, hopefully it will come out in next February. Amaru is the name of the poet. In some text he is called Amaru, in some other text he is called Amaruk, but in most texts Amaru is the um, preferred name. Shatak in Sanskrit means a century, and Amaru Shatakam is a collection of love lyrics just over 100 in number, and they are all in what you described in the Muktaka Chandas. Each is a separate, self contained, well said verse. Now, the Amaru Shatak has been around for a long time, and its standing in the world of Sanskrit literature has always been extremely high. The first critique of Amaru Shatakam, which still exists, was written in Kashmir by a well known critic called Anandavardhan 1,000 years ago, in the, I think, ninth or 10th centuries. And in the words of this critic, each single verse of Amaru has meanings and sentiments which could make a whole poem. So, in other words, that he has got everything concentrated in the way that he's written. And the Amaru Shatakam is all love lyrics. They've been around for a long time, they are contained in anthologies and so on. The text which I used for making my translation is the oldest text available. It was obtained, I think, around the 13th century in central India, put together by a descendant of the famous scholar King Bhoj. And all the verses of the Amaru Shatakam, as I told you, are descriptions of life and love. And his language is brilliant, wonderful, extremely emotive. But the most amazing thing which I discovered while translating and reading the Amaru Shatakam was that his description of love between man and woman is perhaps the most modern in its terminology and its feel that I've seen anywhere else in Sanskrit literature. So the verses are about social life, about physical unions, about separations, about fights, quarrels, making up, getting together again. And all these episodes of human love are described in a way which could make them, you might say, relevant for any part of the world in any time, because they are all speaking about universal qualities. And eventually, love does have universal qualities, and there's no separation there. And I would have liked to read you out some of these verses, but that is too complicated a thing, as I told you. So I can,
Yes, please.
I just want to tell you that they are uh, something which you will need to watch and see when they come out. And I haven't brought them out here
We look forward to that.
because it hasn't been published yet. That wouldn't stop me from reading it, because I did circulate some of those verses to my friends and they liked them that way. But I haven't got them here for me to read. But I tell you just one opening verse.
Hmm.
And in that opening verse, he addresses in very tender but also very brilliant language the face of a young woman just after the sexual act is over. And he says that may this kind of glow upon the face protect the reader. So, he's not addressing gods and goddesses, he is talking about such things. And there are many such verses throughout, and I wish I had them here with me so I could read them out. Another verse, for example, is addressed to a young woman. It says that, what is it about you that has attracted that man so much that he cannot leave looking at you? So this kind of thing, you see.
That's very relatable.
Yeah. So this is what Amaru Shatakam is going to be, and well, at this moment they are doing the covers and the proofs and so on.
We really look forward to that, sir. So, talking about nayikas, and then of course the gods. I mean, in Brihad Aryanaka Upanishad, they say that you are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny. So, there's always this whole idea of the Purusharth, the goals or the aims of a human life, Dharma, Kama, Moksha, and Kam is very prominent. So he figures prominently in everything, every aspect. He sort of permeates through this. Now, I want to ask you a question. Um, Even in the Shukta Saptati, where there are episodes of gods who are up to some mischief, can we say that we were once more open about these things, or is it just an aberration? So it was just an aberration then as it is now.
Well, this is a very wide-ranging question that you are asking me, and let me try to figure out what best I can tell you as an answer. You see, to put it in very brief words, Purushartha. The word Purush here does not mean man or woman. The word Purush here means person. And you will be interested to know that Kama Sutra, which is now so famous, begins with no prayers to gods or mention of divine beings or anything. It begins by extolling the Purushartha. And Purushartha means the human ends. And the Kama Sutra says that there are three human ends in life: dharma, artha, kama. No moksha. Moksha is something added on later on, and moksha is not for this life, moksha is something for a subsequent life. But dharma, artha, and kama, he says these are the three ends of human life, and one who wants to have a full life must make full use of all ends, not give precedence to one and ignore the other two, but have them all combined. And then it says that on dharma and artha, many people have written texts. And he said that on kama also many people have written texts, but I am now going to write another text on kama, which will combine the knowledge and distill it from all the previous texts. So this is how it goes on. So this is how kama is seen there. And kama means, essentially the dictionary meaning of kama is desire. Desire for pleasure. And then part of desire for pleasure is desire for physical pleasure. And that is where kama comes in. And this is how the word has, over the time, as I told you, it consists of 7 books. One book is about sexual life and how to copulation and things like that. The other 6 are about other things, but this is how it exists. Now, what was the other thing you asked me about here? About
about the gods, and about how if the gods are shown particularly in all these works, they're shown up to some mischief or the other. We hear the gods themselves are engaged in activities related to calm. Now, were we once upon a time more open, or is it just an aberration as we think of it now?
well, you see, again, in those days thinking, it was possible to depict heavenly beings, that is what's meant by gods, and human beings, which are meant human persons, either separately or together. So it was possible to depict heavenly beings with human emotions, that is to say, gods displaying and acting with human emotions, and human beings acting with divine emotions. So it also described human individuals who displayed divine traits in their how they get along. And in these descriptions, gods were shown as getting into many situations which at another level could have been common human situations, but because they were described as that of gods, people took more notice of them. And one of the most famous stories, it is not in the Shuka Saptati, but it is in my book, which is called The Seduction of Shiva. It's a story from the Bhagavat Puran. And this story is the story of Vishnu's incarnation, the god Vishnu's incarnation as Mohini, to seduce another god who is described as Shiva. And it's a story of seduction, and it is couched in very brilliant and very effective language, which deserves to be read in the original. But of course, I can only do it in a translation. But such things exist also. So there are plenty of these. It's not confined to one instance. Sanskrit literature is full of material where human and divine is shown together, meeting each other, uh, interacting, behaving about like each other, things like that. You see.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question about how this Naika, like because are these works in Sanskrit literature, are they more from a man's point of view, or because there's almost always the description of the Naika or her, like it's always about her physical attributes, particularly the parts of the anatomy, or so basically the Naika is reduced to the physicality, whereas the Nayak is always, his attributes are about bravery, his virya, or his generosity, his strength, his eloquence, and all the various talents that he has. So if I'm not wrong, I mean this is what I understand this. So from the corpus of the erotic verses, this is what I get. So is it that the Naika is just an adjunct to lovemaking more than anything else? Does she have a voice?
Well, this is again an interesting question, and let me give you first a little background. The impression that all Sanskrit poetry, including love poetry, is written by men is again a misperception which prevails today because people don't, lots of that literature has gone under the shadows. Now, in my collection of Subhashita Bali verses, there are about 500 or 600 verses there, which you have seen. Some of them are anonymous, others have authors' names, but there are verses there by at least 7 women. They are named, and they are all well known writers of Sanskrit verse, and their verses have been considered good enough by the anthologists to quote them there. And many of those verses are about love and erotic life, but many of them are about life in general. In one verse, I'll give you the names of some of these ladies because they deserve to be remembered today. One lady's name is Morika. Another is Vikat Nidamba. Another is Subhadra. And there are others like that. And in one verse, I think it is by this lady Subhadra, she says that just as milk is boiled to make ghee, ghee is boiled to make butter, butter is boiled to make something else. Similarly, love also changes face as it's boiled again and again. So, it's a thought which is being put in a very simple language, but it is a very expressive thought. And similarly, there are many other verses like that. And there are, I mentioned to you these Amaru Shatakam. The verses in Amaru Shatakam descriptive of women, what they do and how they act, are not confined to these physical things which you mentioned, but they cover all aspects of life. And to mention to you another work, this is not an anthology, this is a whole book written in the Muktaka Chanda. It is called Vijayavardhana. And the writer is a lady called Ganga Devi, and she was a princess in the then Vijayanagar Empire. You know, there was a Vijayanagar Empire which existed in southern and central India at once upon a time, and it is about their wars with the invaders, the Afghans, and their victories. So it is an interesting thing that you have this kind of writing also. It's all there.
In the meantime, I'm going to take up a question from the audience. The question is, when would you think that Sanskrit began to be cleansed of erotica? What could have been the reason? Because at some point it did happen.
You see, this concept, the Sanskrit was cleansed of erotica, presupposes that erotica is something which is dirty. I can't read. Just get me my glasses. Ah. You see, to put it like this, erotic verses, what are now called erotic verses, but they were a part of the bigger whole, are to be found right from the beginning of Sanskrit literature to the most recent of Sanskrit literature. To say that they were cleansed of it would be a reflection of the spirit in which the question is voiced. There's no question of cleaning. What happens was, over the years, as the study and the reading of Sanskrit literature got more and more confined to a smaller community of people, because others were then reading other languages which were more predominant at their times. The literature which remained before people's eyes tended to become more and more religious and scriptural, philosophical, religious mantras be used in pujas and things like that. But all the other literature was there, and it continued to exist, and it's still there. And some of it was known, and some of it was almost forgotten. And the object of translation just now is to bring some of that back into the public light. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I think another area, for example, to mention to you, you're talking about erotica, what you describe as erotica. This is an erotic satire. The name is Samaya Matrika. The English translation of the name is Courtesan's Keeper. It was written by a famous writer in Kashmir 1,000 years ago. And it is a satirical description in great detail of the red light district of the then capital of Kashmir, which was then called Pravasapura and now called Srinagar, same place. But you have these kind of works, they exist. The only thing was that they had tended to be, when I made the translation of Samaya Matrika, I tried very hard to find any translation made before into English. And I came to the conclusion that my translation of Samaya Matrika, which came out as the Courtesan's Keeper, was the very first translation into English. And it's there in the Penguin, you can see it, and it will give you an idea of what it's all about. So you have this kind of situation in Sanskrit all the time. There are many works which deserve to be.
Would you like to read something?
Yeah, okay. So you might, does your audience have any more questions?
They do, and I do too. But we would love you
Please,
to read something if it's possible.
you'd like me to read something? Okay, then you'll have to give me a few minutes to get it out. Just give
Sure, in the meantime, I'm going to look for some questions from the audience.
Yes,
So,
please.
so if you have questions, we can take them now.
Are you giving me questions or do you like me to read out something to begin with? Then you can ask questions also.
Well, people are really enjoying this, and I have to say we have a sizable number of women in the audience, which to me is really, I mean, very encouraging. I'm so happy people have really enjoyed this, and we are continuing. So please don't go away. And Sir is reading something from his text
Okay.
in the
Yeah.
meantime.
Now I'm going to read to you a few translations which I've made especially for this program by women writers, poetesses, which are there in the Subhashitavali, which in the book you got the book. This writer, her name is Subhadra. Love is like milk. It is boiled and cream is taken out. Then it is churned to make butter and boiled again for ghee. Loving seems to get attached always to some kind of calamity. So now this is one verse. This is another writer. Her name is Morika. Love, he's addressing the lady. Love, you deserve this paragon, and she deserves you equally. The moon shines not without the light, and a moonless night must dismal be. So you see, you have verses of this kind scattered all over. Now, please, but I just don't want to spend my time reading verses for you. I've got many more to read, but
Oh, we would love that. Um, so I think I mean, people have indeed asked questions, but I think what you read from Subhadra is possibly the thought of many of us, many women. So here's a question: do you think that the translations of some of these works into Hindi would be a valuable contribution to public culture, especially given the misogyny and the chauvinism around us?
well, I think it would be wonderful if they could be done. I can't tell you very much about Hindi translations from Sanskrit. I know that several have been made. The most famous Hindi retelling of a Sanskrit story is, of course, the Ramcharit Katha Manas by Tulsidas, which is a retelling of the Valmiki Ramayana, as you know. So this process has been going on for a very long time. But these verses from Subhashitavali could do with a Hindi translation. I've seen a Hindi translation of Subhashitavali verses not set out in poetic form, but in literal form. So it means people are paying attention to it, but they haven't done it to the extent it deserves to be done.
All right. I'm going to ask you a question. I feel like there is an urban-rural divide in some of the texts that like when the characters, some of these texts are from. So there are men about town, the Nagarakas, the self-indulgent urban city dweller, and then of course Shringar seems to be like a preoccupation of these men who are Nagarakas, and they're sort of so much so that the Anandavardhan in your book on aesthetics, in this book, Dhyan Valoka, he says vulgarity would debase Shringar and uses the term Gramayata, literally the village or the rural, as a synonym for vulgarity. So, so Anandavardhan says, that vulgarity would debase Shringar and uses the term Gramayata, literally village or rural, as a synonymous, synonymous for vulgarity. So would you agree with this, that it is a entirely city person or a Nagaraka's sort of preoccupation?
Well, you see, at one level, one cannot disagree at all. Social life in ancient times, as in today's time also, existed in people who were living in cities and people who were living not in cities but in rural surroundings. So there were people who had been exposed to and brought up in urban cultures, and there were people who had been exposed to and brought up in rural cultures. It's a fact. But then to say that literature is only about one kind and not the other kind, this is a conclusion which is not correct. Because you will find, to give you an example, even in the best known plays in Sanskrit are by Kalidasa. I'm not saying that they are the best, but they are certainly the best known. There are three of them. And in all those plays, there are characters who are Nagarakas, urban people who are speaking in sophisticated Sanskrit, and you have other people who are speaking not even in sophisticated Sanskrit, they are speaking only in Prakrit. That is a dialect language used in rural surroundings. And you'll be interested to know the play which I have recently translated, which is called Vikram Urvashi. In that play, the hero is a king, and his beloved is Urvashi. And a point comes in the play, a dramatic point, when his beloved disappears. So one whole act of the Kalidasa play is devoted to the lover, the king, going around by himself, dancing, singing, and weeping, and looking for his beloved. And all the verses in this act, which are uttered by the king, unlike in other places where royalty speaks high class Sanskrit, in this play, the verses are songs, dancing songs, which the king recites in Prakrit. So you see, you have this kind of situation also. It is not, things are not absolutely so watertight as people tend to make it out to be. And you have literature at a social level. Of course, there are distinctions between urban and rural, but in literature, both can be seen. Another work which I have done, which you could look at, it is the 70 Tales of the Parrot, Shuka Saptati. And Shuka Saptati is describing stories. Some of them are set in cities involving high class people, but most of them are set in villages with people who are farmers, people who are cobblers, people who are doing small things, and who are speaking in a simpler language and expressing their emotions. So you have that also. So but this second aspect of Sanskrit, it so happens, in the course of the last few centuries, had tended to get a little overshadowed because the attention was focused only on one aspect and the other aspects got left out. And there is much material in Sanskrit which I like your audience to know, which exists but is still virtually unknown. So you have material like this, it deserves to I'll give you another example. We've talked a lot about Kama Sutra. The Kama Sutra itself mentions 8 preceding works upon which it is based. The author of Kama Sutra does not hesitate to mention all the people whose works he consulted in writing Kama Sutra. What is less known now is that Kama Sutra had at least 7 or 8 redoings written later on. And the latest work based on the Kama Sutra, according to my information, was discovered in present day central India, in the Telugu land. And the name of the work is Rati Rahasya. And the author of Rati Rahasya is a person called Ali Akbar Shah. So it shows you that literature is not confined to people, it also has a habit of intermingling. So these are things which people need to know, and I'm hoping that our conversation and other people who think about these things will lead more people to look at those aspects of Sanskrit literature which deserve to be more known today.
Right, sir. Sir, is there anything else that you'd like to read, or while you're having a glass of water or something, I can read a question that has come about, and then I'll take up other questions. Here is a question. Um, could you talk a bit about your work, Seduction of Shiva?
Well, for your information, this is a work which Penguin brought out. And they chose to give it the title Seduction of Shiva, which is the title of one of the translated stories, one out of about 35 translated stories in that book. When they wanted to focus on Seduction of Shiva, that is Mohini and Vishnu, which is a wonderful story. And so they did that. But the totality of the stories in this book, Seduction of Shiva, are stories on life and love. And they are drawn from an entire cross section of Sanskrit literature, right from the beginning to as recent times as possible, and both from scriptural works and from what are now called secular works. So there are stories from the Puranas, from the Vedas, Rama, from the. I told you about the story which I took from the Mahabharata. There's another story from the Ramayana about the love affair between Ravan and Rambha, which is taken from Valmiki. And then there were many stories which I took from works which are not so well known about life between There's a story about two traders who met each other on a sea voyage, and they got to know each other very well, and they both had families, and they became such friends that they said that when our children grow up, they must get married. And one trader had a beautiful daughter, and the other trader's son was born as a dirty dwarf. So then the problems arose and all that kind of thing. So those things are there. So you have this kind of material, and in my opinion, the stories in Seduction of Shiva are a very good reflection of the cross section of the variety which is available in love depicted in Sanskrit literature.
Okay. One last question from my end, and then I'm going to take up audience questions. Um, is there a Kama Sutra for women? um, or a woman. Um, there, the one by Vatsayana is more from a man's perspective. That's written for a man, as a manual, like, or it's written for men. Is there a Kama Sutra amongst the many Kama Sutras that actually is from a woman's point of view?
You see, the Kama Sutra itself, the belief that Kama Sutra is for men, is itself a mistaken, disproportionate belief. The way the history of Kama Sutra goes on in this country, as I told you in the beginning, it consists of 7 books. One is about sex life, and the others are about social life of various kinds. And the book on sex life received a great deal of attention, and it's around. You can find it pictures. It's a pornographic picture. There's a whole industry built around it. You can find it anywhere. But the totality of it, which consists not only of sex life but also of social life and how to get along in life and so on, this is not there in most books. And what is also missing in this way is the chapters of Kama Sutra which are devoted and addressed to women. So there's a whole chapter of Kama Sutra which is describing what he says, what the writer Kama Sutra says is talking about sexuality. That's the word you used in your title of a play. Feelings aroused by sex. He said, at one level, there may be different feelings based upon physical differences between men and women. And he goes into detail to describe those physical differences and the results they have on either partner in a union. But then it says that beyond the physical differences, at another level, at the most basic level, the feelings of love are the same. This is what the Kama Sutra says. Then it has a chapter, as I told you, which is describing that it is as important for women to study it and to learn from it as it is for men. And he says that it is not this, I'm not writing this book for men, I'm writing this book for everyone. He says so in so many words. And he gives a whole long list of subjects in which education of girls should be carried out. And they are not only just housekeeping and cooking and things like that, but it covers everything under life. So you see, it's a list which could be equally applicable to men. So you have this kind of thing. I can't speak to you about the whole range of Kama literature because this is the only one I have done. But to say that Sanskrit literature is just male-oriented, nagaras and so on, and not towards the heroines. Heroines are only seen as sex objects. This is not correct. And this will become very clear for anyone who has the opportunity of reading the verses of the Amaru Shataka. Because the Amaru Shatakam verses describe love feelings of men, love feelings of women, their feelings for each other, the kind of joys they bring to each other, the kind of despair and anger they bring to each other, and everything is spelled out very nicely, you see, in Amaru Shatakam. And I would have been very glad to read something out to you from there, but it's not available to me right here in front of me. Because what I did made a small note of to read to you was Sanskrit verses composed by women poets. And that is what I'll be
Thank
reading to
you
you.
so much for that, sir.
I'll
It
give you
was
just
very considerate, thoughtful.
I'll just give you another one, very small verse. This is a verse reflecting human male and female relations. The writer is a poet called Nitamba. Amuse your fickle heart, O bee, in other vines where flowers can all your rough caresses share. Why squeeze and crush before its time that young bud of the jasmine, still tender and of its pollen bare? So you see, you have verses like this, and
Sir, if my Sanskrit lessons serve me right, I just want to ask you, it's sort of politically incorrect. Isn't Vika Vikata Nitambika Nitamba a rather naughty word?
you see, again, it is a question of someone who looks at Sanskrit through Hindi eyes. The word vikat is the opposite of the word sankat. And in Sanskrit, please look at your dictionary. Sankat is something narrow, vikat is something broad. So, vikat nitamba here does not mean something, as you're putting it, which could be some kind of a.
I thought it meant broad-hipped.
No, vikat means basically it means broad hipped. So but the fact is that this is her name, and she's known very well with that name, and she has written many verses, and there you could find them scattered in the Subhashitavali. And so, so anyway, this is how you have these things.
Okay, sir.
But I'm
Uh,
glad that you are asking these questions because obviously you have studied Sanskrit yourself at some stage, and you know something about it, and that is very good.
Only at school level. I think my Sanskrit teacher was good. So I think I should thank her for being able to translate this spontaneously. So there is another question here we have. There are many, but I'm going to take up a question which I think your another diplomat historian has asked you. This is from Mr. Raghavan, who says, "Thank you for a wonderful talk. I would like to ask a question that may be outside the framework of your talk. Sheldon Pollock has spoken about the death of Sanskrit. Do you agree with this thesis? Secondly, do you think that the impression of Sanskrit poetry was overwhelmed by sensuous poetry contributed to a greater neglect of Sanskrit, especially from the late 19th century?"
Well, I have read that article of Sheldon. Also, I happen also to have met Sheldon Pollock and have discussions with him. And in fact, for one of my books, he even contributed an article. And of course, he is at liberty and free to make his own opinions. And this doesn't mean that his opinions will be acceptable and shared by everyone. And I find some of his opinions are all right, but other opinions I don't agree with them. So you have this kind of thing happening in all literary discussions, and he happens to be one of the literary discussants there. But I still feel that he has still to reach the heights of another scholar whom I happen to know quite well. His name was Dr. Anthony Warder. And Anthony Warder was married to an Indian lady, and he was living in Toronto where he was the professor, and I happened to get to know him quite well. He's passed away, of course, but he has written a multi volume, I think at least 8 or 9 volumes, history of Indian classical literature. And that covers, is the most broad based coverage of Sanskrit literature that you can find anywhere. So I think maybe Sheldon Pollock will also do something like that at some stage.
Second part of the question, however, is I'll read it out. Um, it's Do you think that the impression of Sanskrit poetry was overwhelmed by sensuous poetry and it contributed to a greater neglect of Sanskrit, particularly from the late 19th century onwards?
Well, again, you see, it depends upon what you mean by poetry. If you mean by poetry what is written in verse, not in prose, please remember that all Mahabharata and all Ramayana, they are both written entirely in verse. So, from that angle, they are both works of poetry. And to say that, but when you say that poetry has been neglected, so you're not meaning works which are written in verse which have been neglected. What you mean is that a particular kind of work has been neglected. And that is quite possible that a certain kind of work which had a very limited appeal uh, got left behind. That kind of thing. Not all of it. Now, both Ramayana and Mahabharata contain very fine and exemplary erotic descriptions. You have to look at them to see for yourself. And the stories inside them. Ravan and Rambha, Tara and Sugriv and in Ramayana. And in the Mahabharata, so many stories, Kunti, Draupadi, Kaikeyi, Gandhari. There are all kinds of interesting stories. But they are not just poetry, they are, everything is in verse, but they are expanding upon other things also. And to consider that poetry is confined to erotic matters is to look at have a very narrow view of poetry, because poetry is much more all embracing, in my opinion.
Thank you for taking that up, again in detail, sir. Um, I just want to take up a few other questions. Many questions. I know that we've run out of time, and I'm sorry about that. but there are lots of questions. I'm going to take up a few here. As I mentioned earlier when we were talking, how often do you get to see people who were born before independence? So here comes another question, which is, as our viewer puts it, um, your education is sandwiched between two elite English schools and universities. Could you tell us how your experience has been, how your experience was during your learning years, and how Sanskrit relates to that?
Well, you see, as a child, I was sent by my parents to a school where the parents were asked to indicate a classical language that the child will study. So my parents put down Sanskrit there. So that's how I first got into studying Sanskrit. And I studied Sanskrit as a child. I did examinations and so on as they are done. And I learned a certain, I was lucky enough to be taught by very good teachers. But then after I left school and I went to college and then I went into the foreign service and so on, I had a gap of something like 40 to 50 years when I was engaged with other things and my connection with Sanskrit tended to decline, decay. So after I retired, I thought that I would like, and I had more time at disposal, I thought that I would like to try to revive my knowledge. And I came to the conclusion that the best way of my reviving the language would be to get hold of a text which I had learned in school and try to translate it on my own. So I got hold of a copy of the Panchatantra and I started translating Panchatantra stories. And then I was lucky because there were people here in Delhi who, there was a newspaper man and he said, we like to have one story every week to publish in our newspaper Sunday. And then after 1 year of this going on, then another publisher approached me and he said that we would like to put them in a book. So this is how my first book came out. But in the process of translation, I discovered that translation itself can be a very good method of learning, relearning. And so then from that Panchatantra, I started off, and then I went on into more complicated matters, and then it's been going on since then. So this is how I got into Sanskrit.
And I have to say, you're doing us a great service, sir. I mean, to have brought all these names that were pretty much forgotten or neglected is indeed a great service. So I want to actually mention at this point that Smita Lahiri has really helped us, because I was wondering what to read on Mahabharat, and she's recommended Carol Satyamurthy's recent work. Okay, so another question that I've been waiting for, and I was hoping somebody would voice it, um, is the question on same sex love. How and does it appear, and how does it appear in Sanskrit literature?
Same sex love, did you say?
Yes, sir.
Well, the only work on which, which goes into such matters, which I have happened to read and translated, is the Kama Sutra. And Kama Sutra has a section on this same sex love, both men as also women. And it describes it, and describes the reasons for it, and describes the feelings, etc., which it gives rights to. So, and it has done it in a very, how should I put it, in a fairly factual manner, as far as he knew. But of course, that's a very smaller part of the Kama Sutra. Most of it is about normal love.
Heterosexual love. Great. So I think we also have a few questions about the craft of translation. How do you capture the differences in colloquial Sanskrit levels and registers. And like, how do you do this translation? Do you use your erudite colloquial styles of English to mark that? So how do you really go about capturing the differences in the levels of Sanskrit, like if it's colloquial Sanskrit, and how do you sort of um, mark that? How do you sort of
Well, this is not an easy question for me to answer. I read a text in the original. When I read a text in the original, at one level I try to understand what it says. At another level, I try to appreciate the feelings it gives within me. So I try to find from a text both the literal meaning as well as the literary sense which I get out of it. And then in the act of translation, I try to reflect both of them. And I try as far as possible to do it without getting into secondary sources. So it's just me and the Sanskrit text, and I don't get into other things where I consult our dictionaries. But I find that now my consultation of dictionaries is getting a little less, but still, you see, one of the remarkable things about Sanskrit is the same sense has many, many multiple words. So, and you can always keep coming across new words which mean things which you've known in some other with some other name.
Right. So we have another question, sir, although it's not directly related to Sanskrit literature. So we asked if Mr. Haksar has come across, um, and would you like to share your thoughts on love and eroticism in non-Sanskrit text? And mentions I'm sorry, I'll not be able to pronounce this correctly. Gatas Gata Saptasati. Gata Saptasati. Right, I got it. So Hala's Gata Saptasati.
The name is Gatha Saptashati. You see, just as there exists work in Sanskrit, there also exists quite a lot of work in what is now commonly known as Prakrit. They are really Sanskrit dialects. For example, all the Buddhist scriptural histories are written in Pali. For people who read both Pali and Sanskrit, they can see the description, the connection between the two languages. But at the same time, they can see that they are different. And there are many other dialects which arose out of Sanskrit. And there are many Prakrits of different kinds. They are all operational. And in some of those Prakrit dialects, very important works have been written, which exist, which are mentioned in histories of literature and so on. But I fear my knowledge of Prakrit literature is not that great. The nearest I have come to it is in this Kalidasa play which I talked to you about. And the Prakrit used by Kalidasa in his play, I could understand only with the Sanskrit transliteration of the Prakrit verses provided by the editor. Because just by the
Right.
Prakrit, it didn't make sense to me. So you have this kind of things.
Right. So about same-sex love, another viewer comments that a homosexual is referred to as kliba, or somebody who's literally unmanly. And but person who has intercourse with this person is seen as the purush, so he embodies the manliness. So this is a comment that came just now. All right, sir, I think oh wow, there's another question from Intact Kashmir. I think we'll take this one and then we'll close this. As an outsider to Sanskrit, cannot but appreciate this lecture. Speaking about translation, was wondering where to locate I'm sorry, I'll not be able to do this justice, but I'll try. Renku deed blankets in Sanskrit text.
Answer to the last question is that I can't help you. I'm sorry, I don't know where you can locate a particular text. And for this earlier text, whatever little I have read about sex in Sanskrit is really Kama Sutra. And it is there in Kama Sutra in great detail. And anyone who's interested in knowing this, to the extent that the Kama Sutra has given information on this, please have a look at my translation. And for your information, that translation was not only published in India, it was published in London, it was published in New York, it's all over the place.
Right. Thank you so much. So wonderful this, and I know that we exceeded the time limit that we had discussed, but there are so many more questions that I haven't taken. um, I think yes, thank you, Ambassador, for your thoughts. And wow, so there more questions. And do you think we can take one more question, one last question, sir?
Well, okay, just one last, because I think now the time has come for. Uh,
Absolutely, sir. Okay. So, so the question is, do you find social prejudice towards the um, Antajaya in the Kama Sutra?
Social credit?
Prejudice.
Is there a social prejudice towards the Antajaya in Kama Sutra?
Antajaya. Antyaja. You mean
Antajaya.
you mean people belonging to a lower class?
Antajaya, yes.
Antyaja, basically what you're meaning, a scheduled caste.
Right.
In the Kama Sutra, there is no caste differentiation. They divide, they are men and women, and then the other sexual divisions they made are between homosexuals, multisexuals, that kind of thing. That's all. Polyandry, polygamy, monogamy, these things they cover. He does not get into anywhere into caste, into things like that in the Kama Sutra. But he does
Right.
describe, and Kama Sutra is something people should read the whole to get an idea of what life in India was like 2000 years ago. It describes sexual practices in different parts of the country,
Hmm.
names the parts and describes the practices. So it's a scholarly work and it deserves to be seen like that.
Right,
Today
sir.
it is,
Thank
today it
you.
is known, unfortunately, as a pornographic work, which
Right. Yes, most people understand that as a sex manual of sorts.
so they should see the whole of it. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Very thank you. This is just a wonderful, very informative, and thank you for giving us so much of your time. I understand that we exceeded this time limit. I want to inform our viewers that on Sunday, tomorrow at 7 p.m., we have Dr. Corinne Lefebvre from Paris who would be joining us, and she'll be talking about Islam and empire in India, and she'll be talking about the Padshah's sacred authority and religious pluralism in Mughal times. That's tomorrow at 7 on the same portals where you are right now. I want to close today's session by, of course, thanking Mr. Haksar and by reminding you all of something that I quoted earlier. You are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny. So, this is something that I found absolutely fascinating. And I think I want to thank Mr. Haksar for making me want to read Sanskrit literature again. And I am going to go and buy many of your books and the ones that I don't have. And all his books have been published by Penguin. And the newest one, the latest one that's going to come out next year, likely to be out next year in February, is on Amaru Shatak, which we actually discussed today as well. So thank you all. Thank you very, very much for being with us. And it was a wonderful talk. And we look forward to you again tomorrow and then every weekend. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.